Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm happy to have with me once again Naomi Oreskes and Brent Cook. Welcome, Naomi, and welcome, Brent, to Turning Hard Times into Good Times.
Thank you.
Yeah, good to be here.
Good to have you both with us once again. Brent, for those of you who, well, most of you know Brent pretty well because he's on this show probably more often than Naomi is. Given his activity as a highly respected geologist, exploration geologist, which is, of course, a topic that we talk about frequently on this show, not as directly related to what we talk about on this show, but certainly, and I think arguably far more important over the longer term, is the work of Naomi on the subject of global warming. Naomi has, as I mentioned, has been with us a couple of times in the past. She's spoken to us about a previous book that she was a co-author of. She is currently a professor of the history of science and affiliated professor of earth and planetary sciences at Harvard University. She started her career as a geologist, received her BS with high honors from the Royal School of Mines, Imperial College London. She then worked for 3 years as an exploration geologist in the Australian outback, so she has that, certainly has that in common with Brent as well. In 1990, she received an interdisciplinary PhD in geological research and history of science from Stanford University. Her 2014 essay, The Scientific Consensus on Climate Change, cited by Al Gore in An Inconvenient Truth, led to op-ed pieces in the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and the San Francisco Chronicle, and to congressional testimony in the United States Senate Committee on the Environment and Public Works. She co-authored with Eric Conway, The Merchants of Doubt. That's The Merchants of Doubt: How a Handful of Scientists Obscured the Truth. That's the book we talked to Naomi about in the past. And just recently, and what we want to talk to her a little bit about today, is her most recent effort, also a collective effort with Eric Conway, a book called The Collapse of Western Civilization, A View from the Future. I would really encourage my listeners to pick up a copy of this book. It's a very small, short, quick, easy read, and it's very inexpensive, just a few bucks. You can buy it online from Barnes & Noble or Amazon. So I really wanted to have Brent with me today, along with Naomi, for a couple of reasons. First, Brent, like Naomi, is a geoscientist, so he brings that background into this discussion far better than I can. And secondly, Brent actually first introduced me to Naomi a year or so ago anyway. So we want to get into this whole discussion of global warming today and try to separate fact from fiction. That seems to be, other than politics and religion, I can't think of many topics that are more heated than this. Certainly people politically on the right want to disbelieve it, and people typically on the left, I would say that's an oversimplification, but people on the left tend to believe it. Well, how could that be true? I mean, it is a scientific issue, and that's what we want to try to pursue as much as possible in the brief time that we have today, to try to separate fact from fiction on this very important issue. It is a very important issue, I think, because on the one hand, if human beings are not responsible for global warming, and we have government imposing huge amounts of taxes, then that would be a wasted resource. But on the other hand, if humans are causing it, and if there's something that can be done to slow down the process of global warming, then we certainly ought to be looking at it for the sake of future generations. So I think let's get right into this whole discussion now. And I would imagine there's going to be people out there who hear this and their dander is going to be raised, the hair on the back of their necks are going to stand straight up. Well, you can go ahead and send questions or comments to questionsfortaylor@gmail.com. Questions, the number 4, Taylor@gmail.com, and I'll be sure to read each and every one of them and perhaps talk about some of them on the air as well in future shows. So, Naomi, before we get started in our discussion, I'm wondering if you could give our listeners just a brief overview of the collapse of Western civilization, your latest effort along with Eric Conway. Tell us what the book is about.
Sure. Well, as you said a minute ago, this is an issue in which facts and fiction get pretty confused. And I had spent about nearly 10 years talking in my classes and public lectures about the facts of climate change. And by that I mean the facts as scientists believe they understand them. And yet, as you pointed out, there are a lot of people who don't believe those facts, who get upset about those facts, who think they aren't facts, who think scientists are wrong. And so I had this slightly crazy idea that if I couldn't reach people with facts, maybe I could reach them with fiction. But with fiction that was based on facts. So many of your readers probably read science fiction, and a lot of people are really interested. Many people who believe in science and technology, who believe in progress through technology, love science fiction. So Eric Conway and I had the idea to make a small work of science fiction. And so this is a book that takes place 300 years in the future, in which a historian is looking back on the present. That is to say, a historian is looking back at us and asking the question, how is it possible that we knew so much about climate change and how the climate system was changing, and yet we did so little to stop it? So that's the question that she, the future historian's a woman, that's the question she poses. And the book is a very short book, as you said. It's an easy read. It's intended to be an easy read. It's only about 50 pages long. It's a sort of novella, really. It's her attempt to try to explain what happened and why it was that so many people resisted accepting the scientific facts around climate change.
Naomi, before we talk further about this topic, tell us a little bit about Eric Conway, your partner on both of the books that you've written so far.
Well, Eric, like me, is a historian. He's a historian of technology. He's written several books on the history of space exploration, space technology, and also aviation technology. He works for NASA. He works at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So he and I came together to write Merchants of Doubt because of work he had done on the history of ozone depletion in the ozone hole. And both of us have always been both interested in the interface between science and technology. And in a way, the paradox that many people love technology and accept technology and yet are suspicious of science, even though all of our most important technologies are rooted in science. Mm-hmm. That's kind of a paradox, that we accept technology but reject science. And so that's one of the many things that Eric and I talk about when we write and think about these problems.
Mm-hmm. Naomi, you mentioned that people don't even agree on the facts. Here's one that was brought to my attention by an engineer in Vancouver. He tells me, and I have no idea whether he's telling the truth. I think he thinks he's telling the truth. But he says there's no evidence that there's been a rise in the atmospheric temperature over the last 15 years. Help me understand. What's the truth on that one?
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting example, and I'm sure you're right. I'm sure he thinks what he's saying is true, and there's many places on the Internet where you can find people making that claim, but it's false. It's not true. It's actually a lie, and it's a lie that's based on something that we've seen repeatedly over the history of the last 15 years or 20 years on this issue, which is cherry-picking the data. There are many people who don't want to believe that climate change is true, and we can talk later about why that is. And that's okay. I understand that climate change is a bad news story. I wish it weren't true either. But what Eric and I have always argued, we argued in our previous book, we argue it again here, is that just because you don't want something to be true doesn't mean you can make it go away by pretending it isn't true. And so one of the big lies that's been told in recent years is that there's been no warming over the last 15 years. That's based on cherry-picking the data and starting the analysis in 1998, which is an anomalously hot year. So if you compare the present to 1998, it looks as if there's been no warming. But if you did the opposite, if you took an anomalously cold year and said, oh my God, there's been an increase in the warming, look how incredibly fast the warming is happening, we would all know that that was bogus. We would all say that's cherry-picking the data. Mm-hmm. If environmentalists or scientists did that, we would reject it immediately. And yet, when climate change skeptics, deniers, whatever you want to call them, do that in the reverse, people say, oh my God, look, there's no warming. It's just not true. When you look at all the data and you don't cherry pick the data, you see that the warming trend has continued. The 2000s were hotter than the 90s were hotter than the 80s, the 80s were hotter than the 70s, etc. There's a consistent warming trend since the 1960s, and there's been no pause, no hiatus, and no stopping of that warming trend.
Okay, so the cause of it, do you relate that to rising levels of CO2?
Well, again, it's not me. It's not what I relate it to. It's what the scientific community does. So we have more than 10,000 people who are members of the American Geophysical Union, even more scientists around the globe, if we include Europeans and Australians and other people who study the question. Much of the data on this issue comes from NASA, which is where Eric works, so he understands the NASA data very, very well. We have overwhelming scientific data that shows us that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has increased. We've been measuring it systematically since the 1950s, so as long as I've been alive and as long as probably a lot of your viewers have been alive. We know that carbon dioxide has increased nearly 40% since the Industrial Revolution. It's been measured. It's not just a theory. We actually have direct measurements of that. And we know that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and we've known that since the 19th century. That was proved by John Tyndall in Ireland in the 1850s. So if you increase the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, you expect the temperature to warm, and indeed all of the available instrumental data says that the temperature has warmed, and that's data both from weather stations on Earth, it's data from NASA satellites, it's data from something called microwave sounding units that are put into the troposphere, it's data from the oceans. We have many different sources of temperature data, and all of them say that yes, indeed, the temperature has warmed, and the increase tracks fairly closely with the increase in carbon dioxide as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here's another objection, one that I heard from another friend this morning. He says, okay, granted, the CO2 levels have risen, he says, and again, I have no idea if this is true or false, he says from 0.035% 50 years ago to 0.04% now. So he's saying this is such a minuscule change, how can you attribute any significance to it?
Well, that's a great question. And I love that one because it's true. Those numbers are correct. And this is one of the things that's hard for a lot of people to understand about carbon dioxide, that it's an extremely powerful greenhouse gas. It doesn't seem like a powerful thing because we can't see it, we can't smell it. There's lots of it in the atmosphere. It doesn't affect us. So it seems hard to believe that tiny, tiny increase could make such a big difference. But think about this. How much arsenic does it take to kill a person? Only a couple of parts per billion. How much testosterone does it take to make a man a man? You know what? It only takes 5 parts per billion testosterone to separate a man from a woman. So tiny amounts of powerful things can make a really big difference in the world.
Well, that's thanks for injecting a little humor there, because otherwise it's a topic that I find very depressing in some ways. And I agree with you that just because you don't want something to be true doesn't make it not true. Does it make it the way you want it to go? So another objection, though, the same person suggested that he says 8 of the last 10 warming cycles, CO2 levels have actually followed. That is, the warming cycle took place and then the CO2 levels followed by something like 500 years. So he's suggesting that you can't just say that there's a cause and effect there. CO2 goes up and that's the cause for warming. Yeah.
That's another common claim, and I'll answer in a minute because I don't want anyone in the audience to think I'm evading or avoiding any issues. But I just want to say one thing before I do. You know, you said this is from the same person. Mm-hmm. I think it's so interesting because I think it actually demonstrates what we're talking about here. People don't want this to be true, so they're looking for reasons for not to believe it. Mm-hmm. They're trying to say, oh, it's such a tiny amount, how could it possibly make a difference? You know, how do we know that's the cause? You know, how do we know that it's proceeding and not following? So they're really searching. It's like they're grappling for some reason to disbelieve the science evidence. And I think you see this really clearly here. So let me just answer that. The answer to that question is we do not know because the data are not sufficiently discriminatory in terms of the timing. So when we look at most of our data on the relationship of carbon dioxide to temperature comes from ice core data. And we have ice core data now from Greenland and Antarctica that goes back nearly 1 million years. And there are data that have been collected by American scientists, by European scientists, by Russians. So we have a lot of data. Those ice cores are very, very detailed, but they're not so detailed. There's not such fine resolution that we can tell the exact year in which these things are happening in most cases. But what we see is that temperature and carbon dioxide track very, very closely together. Now, we know that both options are possible. It's possible that the CO2 goes up and then temperature rises because of it, but it can also go the other way around. If the temperature increases, carbon dioxide is released from the ocean, just like CO2 gets released from a Coke, if you leave a glass of Coke lying around and it warms up. So both are possible, and what we know is that in the past, probably both have in fact happened. So it wouldn't be wrong to say that in the past there were probably times when the temperature went up first and then the carbon dioxide increased. But that's a red herring. It's not the point, because in this case, in the world we're living in now, in this time that we're living in now, not 100,000 years ago, not 500,000 years ago, not a million years ago, but now, the carbon dioxide increased first. And we do have the resolution on that. And we even know who measured it. It was my colleague Dave Keeling, who taught for many years at the University of California, whose son Ralph still teaches there, who I knew them both. I still know Ralph. They have been measuring this since 1958, and we have seen how carbon dioxide has increased, and the temperature increase has followed the carbon dioxide increase. So for the world we live in now, the world that we're trying to deal with, we know what's happening, and we know that it's carbon dioxide that is driving the temperature increase.
And of course,
can I jump in here?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Brent.
As I work with geologists and such, one of the main objections I get to this idea is that throughout geologic history, we've seen warming and cooling periods just over and over again, and I don't know, or do we actually know what caused them? And secondly, how do we know this time is different?
Go ahead, Naomi.
Well, that's a really good question. And the fact is, we don't know what all of the different warming trends from the past have been caused by, or the cooling trends. We have some ideas. We have some evidence. Most of the evidence points to the idea that there are many different things that can cause changes in the climate. So we certainly have evidence that there have been periods in the past where changes in solar radiation have driven climate change. We also have good evidence that changes in the configuration of the continents through continental drift can affect the climate. So there are lots of different things that can cause climate change. But that's true of lots of things in life. There are a lot of things that can make a person sick. There are a lot of things that can make a person happy or sad. If I have an argument with my husband, there are many different possible causes of that. So the issue in life is not that there are many possible causes of things. The issue is, if I've had a fight with my husband and I'm trying to sort it out, I have to figure out why is he mad at me so I can fix that and do something about it, right? So in a way, that's the same thing here. Yes, absolutely, there's been lots of episodes of warming and cooling in the past. The question is, what is driving this warming period? And most scientists would say we have a pretty good handle on that. Now, you could ask the question, well, what difference does it make, since we know there's been lots of warming and cooling in the past? And there the answer is very clear. The difference is the rate. Most of the evidence we have from the past, from the geological record, about climate change, typically those changes have happened over scales of thousands to millions of years. Now we're looking at climate change that is happening on a scale of years to decades. That is to say, within our own lifetimes. And that, of course, raises the other gigantic difference. We weren't alive during the previous periods of climate change, so we weren't alive to suffer. We weren't alive to feel the effects. We weren't alive to have to move our cities when the sea levels rose in the past. But now we are alive, and we live in a world with a tremendous amount of extremely expensive, extremely well-built infrastructure, much of which is sitting at sea level, which is a whole other issue that I guess we'll get into. But we have trillions of dollars just here in the United States of infrastructure within half a meter of sea level rise. And all of the scientific projections tell us that all of that infrastructure is now at risk. So since many of your listeners are business people who are interested in the cost of things, this is where this issue becomes so important for us living now, that we're looking at potential changes in the next 50 years that could cost us trillions of dollars just here in the United States alone, not even worrying about all the other billions of people around the globe who will be affected as well.
Sure, and even as as the sea levels are rising and people want to continue living next to the ocean, though, and they're looking, of course, to lay off those costs by subsidizing insurance costs, I suppose. So, trying to get someone else to pay for their lifestyle, I suppose, which is nothing new. It seems to be sort of a human trait. But Brent, speaking of human traits, I wonder, geologists that I speak to, why do you think it is? We have the same data available to us now. Of course, there's climate there's climate scientists, people that is climatologists. There are people like Naomi who focus in this area. Your discipline is specific to exploring and developing projects, mineral projects. So is it a matter just of people not focusing on this very important issue because they don't have the time, or why do you think that the geologists, that at least the ones that I talk to, are so divided on this issue? I say you can almost flip a coin when I talk to geologists, and half of them are, not believing that it's human caused, and half of them do, perhaps.
Yeah, that's a good question. There's probably a number of actual reasons behind it. My own case, I was pretty much indifferent to the idea, but I can see on the ground, exploration ground has been opened up, lots of it, by the receding ice sheets. There are new properties being explored and drilled and discovered today that 20 years ago were under ice. So you can see those things happening. And I went in and did a whole lot of actual research into this. And I think this is something that we need to differentiate here, is between peer-reviewed, real science, as opposed to an article put out in Forbes or on NBC or something. That needs to be addressed as well. I think it also comes down to a large degree is, as a geologist, we think a million years is nothing at all. So what we're seeing happening has happened in the past, it's happening again. And until you come to the realization this is happening really fast, and we know the reason behind it, we've got thousands of scientists independently confirming this from all different angles, then it starts hitting. And the second reason people don't, in my field, in all fields, don't buy into this is it really gets down to, as you say, philosophical. Either you're a liberal or you're a conservative. And it really breaks down that way without people doing the actual research to come up to their, own educated decision on this.
It gets back to what Naomi was talking about a little while ago. Just because you don't want to believe something is true doesn't mean it's not true. And I think it's something that we all have to examine our own hearts and minds with in almost anything we do. Ask ourselves, are we being honest and are we being objective about the issue at hand? And it seems to me, Brent, though, that your colleagues are looking at the same data, and yet they're not understanding. Maybe just to review the whole notion of the scientific method, Naomi, maybe you could just talk to that a bit and suggest why it is that people are coming up with all kinds of ideas about this issue.
This is a very important point, because many of the people who are coming up with all kinds of ideas are not actually looking at scientific evidence. They're going to the internet and they're going to websites where people are deliberately promoting, for whatever reason, misinformation, cherry-picking data, arguments against climate change. And when I give public lectures, I generally hear the same objections over and over again, and often the exact same words are being used by people. So that's kind of a clue that they're getting them, from some external source. If you actually look at scientific data, which is what I did back in 2004 and how I originally got into this whole issue, if you look at the peer-reviewed scientific papers, what you find is there's essentially no argument among scientific researchers, people who are actually doing the work, looking at the data, that climate change is happening, that it's real, and that it's being mostly driven by greenhouse gases, also to some extent by deforestation and agricultural practices. There's just no argument about that among the scientific research community. But that brings us to the question of what does it mean for something to be scientific research? And that's a complicated question. But the short answer is that it's published in peer-reviewed journals, that scientists collect data, or they run models, or they do calculations, and then they present that work to their colleagues, to other scientific experts, for critical scrutiny. And they subject their claims to the critical scrutiny of other people. And that's what peer review is all about, that other experts look at it and they say, well, okay, do these claims stand up to examination? So if you take that claim we discussed a few minutes ago, that the warming has stopped, well, it turns out that claim does not stand up to scrutiny. It's based on cherry-picking data. And when you look at all of the data, you find that it's false. So that paper would be rejected, and it would not be published in a peer-reviewed journal, assuming that the process is operating correctly, which most of the time it does, not always, but most of the time. And so scientists place very high stock in peer review because that's the mechanism that scientists use to weed out claims that are supported by evidence and claims that are not. So it's really a crucial process, and that's why people like myself, when we talk about this issue, we're always referring back to the peer-reviewed literature, because there are all kinds of claims that people make all the time about all kinds of things in life. I mean, people will claim that, you can improve your sex life by eating rhinoceros horn. Right? But it doesn't make it true. So the question is there evidence to support it? Has someone done a clinical trial? Well, that's a tough one because, of course, rhinoceroses are endangered species, so we shouldn't be doing it. But it's also a tough one because the quality of your sex life is highly subjective. But if it's something that's more easily measured, then we actually can subject these claims to peer review, and we can find out whether or not the evidence supports them. And that's really the crux of what scientific research is really all about.
Okay, so, for example, I recently came across an article in Forbes it's titled, "It's the Sun, Stupid," and they're basically, saying that it's the sunspots or solar activity that has been responsible for global warming. Could you talk to that, Naomi?
Yeah, it's hard to talk to that because it gets to the point where I feel like I cannot actually understand what the editors at Forbes are thinking. Because that claim has been printed so many times, and more than once in Forbes, more than once in the Wall Street Journal, more than once in Fortune, and we know that it's false. And the data to show that it's false comes from NASA. And I don't think there's anybody at Forbes who really wants to claim that NASA is a communist front organization. Well, maybe there are some people who think that, but most people think NASA is maybe they waste some taxpayers' money and maybe they're not as efficient as they should be. But NASA is not an environmental front organization. The data, the satellite data that NASA has been collecting since the 1970s proves beyond any possible shadow of a doubt that the sun is not causing climate change. And it's a very simple piece of data, and you can go to the NASA website. I can give you the website, Dan, maybe you can post it on your site so people can go to this.
Okay.
What we know is that sunspots are cyclic. That's why we call them sunspot cycles. And we know that the radiation from the sun goes up and down. And we do have some years that are hotter and some years that are cooler. And we know that there's a 22-year cycle of these things. So if that's what was driving climate change, then what we should have seen would be 22 years of warmth, then 22 years that are cooler, then 22 years that are warmer, cooler, like that, up and down. That's not what we're seeing. What we're seeing is a consistent trend, warmer, warmer, warmer. As I said before, 2000s hotter than 90s, 90s hotter than the 80s, 80s hotter than the 70s. There's just no way to explain that with sunspot cycles. And scientists have said this so many times that some of them have given up saying it because they feel like, well, why should I keep explaining this when these people clearly are not interested in knowing the truth? And that's where it gets into this really tricky thing of why does Forbes continue to publish these claims even though we know they've been refuted by scientific data?
One question I have to ask you about, Naomi, before we let you go, and that is another allegation that I've heard, or at least I've heard this mentioned, that while the ice caps in the North Pole are receding, that's not true on this South Pole.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting one, and it's a little similar to your fellow earlier with the 0.0035% of CO2. So that's actually true. There is evidence that the total amount of ice in Antarctica is increasing, and that simply has to do with the complexity of the climate system, which is to say that one of the things we know is the climate is extremely complex, and if the world as a whole gets warmer, that is to say the average temperature of the globe increases, that doesn't mean that it's going to get hotter everywhere. So it doesn't mean that there will be less snow and ice everywhere. And there are certain conditions under which we actually could get more snow and ice in some parts of the globe in a warmer world. And that has to do, well, it's complicated, but it's the same reason why we have stronger storms associated with climate change. You have more energy in the climate system. So one of the predictions of climate models is that at least certain parts of Antarctica, particularly the eastern part, may actually get more snow and ice in a warmer world. So that's true, but it doesn't refute the overall claim or all of the other evidence associated with climate change. In fact, it's consistent with what the climate models tell us could very well happen.
Well, it certainly is true that we've, this summer we've got a cool summer here in the Northeast. A very, very pleasurable summer. We've seen a very cold and snowy winter last year, and then in Europe it's something completely different. So that's obviously you have to look at the globe as a whole. But, Naomi, perhaps as we close here, one last thought. In your book, The Collapse of Western Civilization, you talk about the failure of markets, the failure of capitalism, I guess. And what I would like to throw out to you and get your response, and Brent, you're free to weigh in on this as well, the notion that it isn't the system that is wrong. I mean, I have a hard time believing that the laws of supply and demand are not, that they can be refuted. But that it's people that are really the problem, that individuals, human beings, are flawed, and that people are willing to hurt one another for their own gain. If I'm polluting a river or something and taking profits from some manufactured product in the process and passing that cost along to future generations, then shame on me. It's not capitalism, it's me as a flawed human being that is not respecting my fellow man. So I would like to just say that what I think is that it's not capitalism per se that's the problem, but it's flawed human beings. What's your take on that?
Well, that's a really interesting thought, and I agree with that. I mean, in a perfect world, if we were all considerate and thoughtful and cared about each other and our children and our grandchildren, we wouldn't just dump garbage in rivers, and we wouldn't just burn fossil fuels indiscriminately. So I think you're right, but at the same time, I think that the economists who point to market failure are right as well in the following sense. We have a system that places value on goods and services, and the prices we pay for things are supposed to reflect the true value. And if the market system is working as it should, then that goes pretty well. The problem is that there are these costs, and it's the cost that economists call externalities. That is to say, you pollute the river, I buy the product you make, I'm not paying for that pollution. That cost is being passed downstream, literally downstream in the case of a river, or metaphorically downstream in the case of future generations. And our system doesn't really have a way to reflect that in the price of the goods and services. And so one of the questions that I hope, your listeners will think more about is, how can we remedy that? How can we have an adequate price signal so that we don't have to restructure the entire system, but we can just remedy this limitation or this flaw in the system that we have? Because the whole point of the new book, and I hope your readers will read it because this is what it's really all about, is that if we don't find some remedy pretty soon, we're going to end up in a much worse situation, a situation where natural disasters and food riots and food shortages actually invite the very forms of authoritarianism that we all, dread. I mean, none of us want to see fascism or totalitarianism in the United States, but if we have food riots, if we have martial law because of flooding and hurricanes, I mean, we saw what happened after Hurricane Katrina, and that was just a small example of what happened. The whole point of this book is that it's an invitation to authoritarian government, and that's an invitation that I think we do not want to extend.
No, I certainly agree with you. Brent, anything to add?
No, I think, I came at this independently, and it's overwhelming the number of different scientific fields that have come to the same conclusion about global warming and what's causing it. I mean, from fellows studying cougars in California to algae in the Arctic to sea life in the in the ocean and that sort of thing. All these different fields come together and are turning up the same result or the same conclusion from all these different angles. And the idea is always posted, well, that's where the money is, and so the research money is going into people who will support that sort of thing. That's complete BS. It's something that needs to be refuted right off the bat, I think.
Well, I would just say in closing to my listeners that Brent Cook is a person that I have had a great deal of respect for. I know that he is. I know him from the mining industry, and he is very highly regarded as an objective thinker, as a person who tells the truth. And that's true because he says a lot of things that people don't want to hear with regard to their projects. So I think I know Brent pretty well, and it was Brent that actually introduced me to Naomi. And I want to thank you, Brent, for that. And I want to thank you, Naomi, for joining me once again to talk about this very, very important issue. The book is The Collapse of Western Civilization, A View from the Future. Be sure to buy it, folks. It's a very inexpensive book. Pick it up at Barnes & Noble or online anywhere. So thank you very much, both of you, Brent and Naomi, for being with me.
You're welcome, Jay.
Yeah, thank you, Jay. It's a pleasure to have a chance to talk with you again.
Great, and I hope to do it again sometime with both of you. Thank you so much.